Welcome. Alright, this is Ryan. I'm doing another video on something that's very common and it's in the mainstream. People are talking about it. The idea of sacred geometry. And I talk to a lot of people about this, and they don't understand often why it's important. Why is geometry sacred? What makes it sacred? Plato and Pythagoras and other great minds used geometry as a language, as a way to describe the laws that are going on all around us in nature and in the universe. So it's sacred because it encodes these laws, whether they be numerical, symbolic, obviously mathematical. They all represent form. Geometry represents form. And what I'm going to show here with some really basic drawings is really focusing on the platonic solids. Platonic meaning Plato. Platonic. It's a platonic relationship. And what's most important about these things is that there's 5 known platonic solids. And what they are is geometric shapes that when put inside a sphere, all the points touch the sphere and all the points are equidistant from each other. So it fits inside a sphere perfectly. And we've only been able to find 5 of these in nature. And they have huge implications, the impact of what they do on the molecular level or the subatomic level is a form. It's a form encoded in nature. And it's important that we understand that these things actually are sacred. And the ancients knew this, and they encoded it in their art, their symbols, their language, and of course their architecture. So, here we go. The universe can be thought of as a circle, as a symbol. The symbol of a circle represents wholeness or infiniteness. Now you can't draw something that's infinite in a symbol, really. So you have to use barriers. So the circle is just a barrier. It goes around and around itself. And it represents a point. And from this point, it is said that all the universe has come out of stillness, out of a point. And the point is the circle. It's also known as the unmanifested. So everything that was manifested, everything that we see in form, first came out of unmanifestedness, pure potential, pure energy, or even people would say stillness, pure stillness. But that stillness has an ability and an urge and an impetus to create or manifest. So, the first thing that the still point does in order to manifest itself is to give birth to itself, which is split itself into 2, or dual. And this duality is the very first thing that you learn in sacred geometry. It's the Vesica Pisces. 2 circles linked together evenly at the first circle's nucleus creates this almond shape where they overlap. And that almond shape has mathematical ratios that actually end up being the square root of 3. This is where the Holy Trinity concept comes in number theory. But more importantly, the symbol, the form. You have 1 circle dividing itself into 2, and there we have the first duality in the universe. So 1 point is now manifested. It's regenerated itself, cloned itself, or given birth to itself. And as this process continues, each one of these still points or circles keeps creating duals or clones. And we'd like to think in terms of dimensions that the first dimension is a series of these still points overlapping in a line or one plane, one dimension. So just dots or points extend only in one dimension we could say on a flat plane. This is what one-dimensionality is about. And you can see that these still points link together like a chain, and they create the first plane, which is the line. And now we have manifestation. We have the first dimension manifested. Now this first dimension manifested is technically going into infinity. There's really no law or anything governing it to stop. So as long as the still points keep giving birth or regenerating themselves, you'll have an infinite unidimension, an infinite flat plane. A line is a single plane. Alright, so what happens next? How does the second dimension come into form? And the circle being a geometric shape, how do other shapes come out of the still point, or other shapes come out of the circle? Well, the duality separates itself in certain cases, where the still point gives birth to a new point, but it's not linked together. It doesn't overlap anymore. And now you have 2 points in existence. They may be next to each other, or they could be all across the universe. This is kind of like what the night sky looks like, where you have stars. They're all intimately connected and have relationships to each other, but they're not connected physically, so to speak. They're not linked. So this is where 2 points are made from one, and they're 2 separate points. And this is what we call differentiated consciousness. This is where individuality begins to be born, where an individual still point gets to see and experience reality from its own unique point in the universe. 2 from 1, duality. Now, how does this happen? How do points give birth to themselves? Or how does the circle spit out a little baby circle? How does this happen? Well, if you look at Russellian science of Walter Russell, you'll find that he actually has learned and in great models shown how light, which is a photon particle, so a point, a circle, cell, actually does this. It goes through this process of pulling in the 4 directions. Now, it's strange that the universe knows, but it does. It somehow knows and intrinsically follows this up, down, north, south, east, west orientation. The universe somehow knows that the northern pole stars are always up and the southern stars are always down. And the entire universe is oriented with these 4 sacred directions. And it's very interesting that this happens. And so all particles are subject to these directions as laws, universal laws. And a particle gets pulled in all 4 of those directions in order to split itself. So it gets pulled on the one-dimensional plane, you could say eastward. And at the same time, it gets stretched north and south. And what happens is this circle gets twisted in all 4 directions simultaneously. And what that does is twist this circle, and eventually that twist breaks it apart, breaks it into 2 differentiated points. And during this process, if we could watch it, say in slow motion, if we could watch light, we would see that this process constantly creates an infinity symbol, which is known as the lemniscate. It's also what we would call the sine wave. It makes a wave. It crests and troughs. And this is where the holy serpent is in all these ancient teachings, is pictures of snakes and serpents and dragons. They all represent this feathered serpent, which is really just the sun, creating a sine wave on everything that it touches or bounces off of. And this is what we see, is this lemniscate, this infinity symbol, this constant sine wave. And a still point representing infinity, a circle, really has no time or space until it decides to manifest something. Because manifestation is movement. So if it's a still point and it's completely still, then it is actually infinite. It permeates everything without manifesting. And so when things get manifested, movement begins. And in movement, on that first dimensional plane, from one point, creating a line, to any other place in that line, you've created distance. And distance equates to time. So time is moving on that flat one-dimensional plane. And time and space are intimately linked and relative. They have a relationship. They're basically the same thing moving in different dimensions. And this is how the second dimension begins to be born. Time on the flat plane, the one-dimensional plane, and space moving, you could say moving upward into the second dimensional space, but it's actually not just moving upward, it's moving with volume. So it's moving up, and it's also moving in diagonals, so it's filling space. And that's why we call it space. It creates a cube. It creates a square unit of volume. And here we have another geometric shape, a square, one of the platonic solids, because of the way it fits into a sphere. But it is representation of the material realm. It actually represents 3 dimensions. So out of the still point, we get flatness, we get upward and downward out of the second dimension, and then we get volume into the 3rd dimension, which is where human beings tend to leave their consciousness. We act as if we only exist in 3D, whereas higher consciousness, very wise people, seers, are able to move their consciousness into the 4D, a 4-dimensional density. It's kind of hard to explain what that is, but it's been done by mystics and philosophers, and even some scientists like Walter Russell. So each dimension implies the dimension that is sort of more powerful and encompassing. So the first dimension implies the second dimension implies the third, and when consciousness is in the 3rd dimension, it implies the 4th. And there's certain geometric shapes that represent this process of movement or transformation through dimensions. And these are the platonic solids. They're certain-sided polyhedrons that, when fit inside a sphere, they encode the changes of each dimension. So, for example, an ice cube, when it melts, its molecular structure changes from a solid cube to a liquid. And then its molecular structure again changes when it goes from a liquid into air or gas, and so on. And that's why these solids are considered sacred. And inside of the cube is perfectly encoded or hidden or implied the famous tetrahedron, the Great Pyramid, which is a four-sided pyramidal structure that has volume. And it's known to be one of the most, people say it's actually the most powerful geometric shape in terms of volume other than the circle, the still point. The circle has the most amount of volume and uses the space perfectly, and so it actually creates strength in all of its curvature. The tetrahedron would be the second most powerful symbol, and it would be one that represents fire in mystical terms, the element of fire, but it also represents transformation of being or transformation of consciousness. And Plato and Pythagoras both talk about these shapes as being a great symbol or language in order to explain or talk about human transformation on the spiritual level or on the mind level or on the mental level. Our structure goes through these changes. And the chakra system is actually symbolically drawn with these platonic solids in mind. As you move up into higher vibration or higher states of mind, these molecular or atomic shapes actually are said to transform in your chakras. So when you're vibrating at a lower density, you would be at a lesser vibrational frequency, and that would be encoded by one of these shapes, one of these 5 platonic solids. And as your chakra wheels spin, you transform, and you basically transform from earth to water to air and fire, and then eventually ether. And ether would be universal mind consciousness, universal mind thinking. And here you can kind of see, as I'm drawing, that the tetrahedron is hidden inside of the cube. And it's perfectly fit in there. It's perfectly mathematically mapped inside the cube. Now, another way in which duality is represented is this concept, this hermetic concept of as above, so below. And you see this in 2 tetrahedrons, one facing up and one facing down, one representing male electric energy and one representing female magnetic energy. And as they merge together, they create this star-like shape, which in 3 dimensions is actually what they call the Merkaba. And it's a symbol that represents transformational energy at high frequency. And it's this union between the heavens and the earth, between the divine cosmos and man, between man's inner reality and his outer reality. And this is a transformational symbol, and it's done through the language of geometry. And this is pointing to why the ancients thought geometry was sacred, because it was a language that you could actually explain these universal principles in. And it's kind of interesting when you take a cube, which we've discovered encodes the tetrahedron, the Great Pyramid, this symbol of strength and fire and transformation. If you unpack a cube, you realize that a cube is a six-sided geometric form. And when you unpack it, you see we get the cross or the crucifix. And this is actually where the symbol comes from. The symbol of the crucifix is a universal symbol, and it actually comes from the sun, because the sun creates a sine wave. So basically the equinoxes on the flat plane of the equator, and the winter and summer solstices on the north-south plane. So you have basically your latitude line and your longitude line crossing, and there you have the Holy Cross. And this is really where the cross comes from. Is this sine wave is represented in different transformational modes, and the cube, being so intimately linked to matter, is six. A six-sided cube unpacked is the Holy Cross in the material realm. So this would be man's consciousness in the 3D, when he's just really only aware of the 3D, really only aware of the Holy Cross. He's body-bound, fairly egocentric and ego-bound, and in lower chakras, which are basically survival and procreation mode. He's not able to contemplate and think about his own thoughts and develop them into higher states when he's just functioning on the 3D. And it is said that he's crucified. That would be his cross to bear. Being an infinite divine spirit encased in a three-dimensional body. That's crucifixion. Now here's the tetrahedron again. 4 sides. And the number 4 being sacred. The triangle being in the 2D, drawn on a flat piece of paper as a 3-sided figure, but drawn in the 3D is a 4-sided figure, because now it has time, space, and volume. And it really represents perfect equilibrium, because it's such a strengthening, or it's just such a strong form. All the weight and volume and mass is so perfectly evenly distributed. This is why it's such a beautiful form. And the ancients, especially the Egyptians, but the ancient pyramid builders built this as a symbol of transformation, of heart, of fire, and of spiritual strength and wisdom, because it points to the sky. And so this is the earth literally connecting to the cosmos. So as above, so below, working directly in our environment as a symbol. This perfect equilibrium, this 4-sided equilibrium, is represented as that spiritual transformation. And so, of course, that spiritual transformation is basically when man's consciousness is perfect, it's balanced in equalized or equilibrium. And that balance is really how you transcend duality. We saw earlier that the still point divides itself and then separates itself into 2, which creates duality. Well, anytime there's duality, you're going to have polarity. Opposite ends of 2 poles, north, south, east, west, male, female, hot, cold, up, down, so on and so forth. So this duality is what we see in the 3D all the time. It's paradoxical, but when you're able to see through it, you're able to see both ends of the dual. So when you're able to see both ends of the duality, you're able to transcend that duality simply by being perfectly balanced. The middle path of the Buddha, so to speak, is the middle way. And that transcendence of duality is when man's consciousness is in higher states, higher frequencies. We all sort of long for equilibrium, don't we? Now, geometry is sacred because it has encoded in it all these universal principles of balance and equilibrium and spirit and consciousness transformation. So there's sovereignty in these forms because they teach us universal principles or cosmic principles that apply to our own being. And so the sovereignty of form, we get formula, the word formula from form. Now, what does it mean? What is a formula? Well, if you break the word down etymologically, we know what form is. We've been discussing that all night. And we know what you means. It's you, it's yourself. And la, in etymological terms, is the same thing as el, E-L. So la and el, or el and la, are interchangeable. And el, in Greek and Hebrew and Aramaic and even in Latin, refers to the Elohim, which is just this divine message, or the messengers of the divine. So the formula, the sovereignty of form, is quite literally the divine message in form inside of you as a human being. So it's the shape, basically it's like the shape of the divine in you. So back to the circle, the still point, or what we would call singularity, right? Single, one. Oneness, represented as a circle, or the infinite, always refers to wholeness, holistic consciousness, unity consciousness, being able to see things that are differentiated, but being able to unify them in your mind, in your being. Syncretically thinking, syncing and linking things together. Now, the number 2, being able to divide itself equally or evenly, refers to polarity or separateness in the geometric world, in the geometric language. And it's really interesting that the word, we're going to break down the word 2 and what it means. One of the ancient names of Thomas Didymus, like in biblical terms, in the Gnostic writings and in biblical writings, Thomas in the Gnostic writings was Jesus' brother. And in some ways, he represents polarity, the person who sort of opposes Jesus, not in a negative way, but in a way for learning. And the word Thomas, etymologically, actually means twain. And twain actually means twin. That's where we get that word, like Mark Twain. His last name means twin. And so Thomas is the same, actually, as Didymus. Didymus in Greek actually refers to being twofold. And so Thomas Didymus literally means twin, or twofold. And this is where we get the idea of the doubting Thomas, right? So Thomas Didymus actually means doubting Thomas. And the word doubt actually is the root for the word double. And what does double mean? Double means two, twofold, twin, twain. So there's ancient knowledge encoded into these names, and the etymology of these names are very symbolic throughout Scripture and biblical text. And so, what is Thomas Didymus actually telling us? He's telling us some secret, sacred geometric information. The form of 2, the form of duality, is about separateness. It's about polarity. It's about division. Not necessarily a negative thing. It's there in order to remind you of what oneness is, or wholeness, or unity consciousness. So when you're functioning in duality, you are functioning and separating and dividing yourself. And things look kind of troublesome and paradoxical when you're in that state. But if you can learn to unify and see things in unity, you create wholeness in your life. And this is what spiritual practice really is all about, unity consciousness. Now we're going to break down another word. This word is pretty awesome. The individual. What does it mean etymologically? What do the roots of this word mean? Well, in is a negation. It can mean inside, but it also means not. Like for example, indecision means you're not able to make a decision. So individual means not, and the root div means divide. And dual means duality. Just like we just discovered, two-ness, twins, twofold. So the word individual literally translates as not divided, but dualistic. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you're not divided, that means you're whole. But if you're whole and you're dualistic at the same time, there's this paradox. And this is pointing to what is an individual. An individual is in this really interesting state of being infinite consciousness or infinite spirit, and at the same time incarnated into the 3D, which is physical matter. So this is that saying where, hey, people are saying, we're just spirits in the material world. We're just this infinite spirit trapped in the reality of a physical body. And that's what an individual is. An individual is not divided, but dual. Having to deal with that dichotomy. And that's sort of the human experience here on earth. So you have to be aware of both. You have to be aware of both poles, and you have to be aware of unity in order to transcend those poles. And remember that we truly are whole, one, and an eternal, infinite being.